The night the music stopped. It was supposed to be another effortless night for Dean Martin. Another velvet-draped evening where laughter floated through cigar smoke, where glasses chimed softly beneath crystal chandeliers, where his voice, warm, lazy, golden, would wrap around the room like a familiar embrace. The Copa room at the Sands Hotel pulsed with quiet luxury, the kind only Las Vegas in its golden age could offer. Men in tailored suits leaned back with confident smiles. Women shimmered beneath low lights, diamonds flickering like distant stars. The band was already warming the air with a slow, teasing melody, and the audience buzzed with that particular electricity that only followed Dean Martin. They hadn't come merely to hear him sing. They had come to feel lighter, to forget, to be carried somewhere softer. Backstage, Dean adjusted his cufflinks in front of a mirror framed with warm bulbs. His reflection stared back at him, polished and calm, perfect hair, perfect tuxedo, the practiced ease of a man who had lived his life in the spotlight so long it had become a second skin. To the world, Dean Martin was cool made human. Nothing rattled him, nothing lingered. Everything rolled off his shoulders like water off silk. But tonight, something was different. He felt it before he understood it. A faint tightness beneath his ribs, a pressure behind the eyes, a sense that the air itself was heavier than usual, as if the building were quietly holding its breath. He had learned long ago to ignore nerves. They came and went. Fame bred rumors and rumors bred storms. He stood in the middle of them all, headlines, whispers, scandals that never quite took shape. But this wasn't that. This felt quieter, sharper, like the silence that settles just before thunder. A stagehand peeked into his dressing room. 5 minutes, Dean. Dean gave him the familiar grin. Take your time, kid. I make my best entrances when people think I'm late. The boy laughed, relief flickering across his face. Everyone relaxed around Dean. He had that effect. He always had. But as the door closed, the feeling didn't go with it. Dean stood, rolled his shoulders once, and reached for his jacket. As he slipped it on, he thought briefly of Frank, probably somewhere across the city, laughing too loud, surrounded by noise. Frank Sinatra lived like a trumpet blast. Dean preferred a smooth piano, different rhythms, same orchestra. They'd both danced around fame, power, and the strange circles that orbited them. You didn't grow that big without brushing against shadows. Dean never pretended otherwise. He just chose not to live inside them. The band struck its opening chord. The room erupted. Dean stepped into the light, and just like that, the weight seemed to lift. Applause washed over him. Familiar, comforting, real. He raised one hand, that easy, crooked wave that always made the crowd feel like old friends. Faces blurred into a warm mosaic of anticipation. The microphone waited. The band softened. Dean leaned in. And the first note slid from him like honey. He sang as he always did, not at the audience but to them. Each lyric a casual promise, each smile a shared secret. The room melted into him. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Conversations dissolved. For those moments, nothing existed but his voice. Halfway through the set, as the tempo lifted and the crowd loosened, something shifted at the edge of the room. Two men entered quietly through a side door. They did not smile. They did not look at the stage. Their eyes moved instead through the crowd with slow precision, cataloging, measuring, dark suits, straight posture, purpose. They stopped near the foot of the stage. At first, no one noticed. Then a ripple passed through the nearest tables, a whisper, a turn of the head. A woman's hand froze in mid-applause. A man leaned back slightly, brow furrowing. The band kept playing. Dean kept singing. But his instincts, sharpened by decades of rooms just like this, caught the change. He felt it before he saw it. The room's breath faltered. The warmth wavered. On the final note of the song, he opened his eyes and saw them. They were not fans. They were not staff. They were not lost. They were waiting. For the first time in many years, Dean Martin's rhythm missed a beat. He covered it smoothly as only he could, offering a grin to the audience as applause rolled through the room. "You're too kind," he said lightly. "Either that or the drinks are stronger than usual tonight." Laughter followed, but it thinned near the stage. One of the men stepped closer. He did not applaud. Dean's smile remained, but his body had gone still. A stillness only performers know, the one that comes when the script vanishes and instinct takes over. He could see the man's eyes now, focused, unimpressed, not here for entertainment. The music softened. The man spoke, not into the microphone, but close enough for Dean to hear. "Mr. Martin, we need a word." The room leaned forward without realizing it had. Dean held the pause. He had built a career on pauses. But this one did not belong to him. He glanced at the crowd, then back to the man. "Now, fellas," he said pleasantly, "if you wanted an autograph, you could have waited till after the show." The man did not smile. "Backstage now." A murmur rose like wind through grass. Dean felt heat crawl up his spine, but he did not let it reach his face. He turned slightly, addressing the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice smooth, measured, "looks like I've been called for a very exclusive encore." A few uncertain laughs. "I'll be right back." He stepped away from the microphone. The band faltered, then stilled. Silence filled the Copa room. As Dean walked toward the side of the stage, the two men fell in behind him, not escorting, not touching, simply occupying space with unmistakable authority. For a fleeting moment, Dean caught his reflection in a mirrored column. He still looked like Dean Martin. But he did not feel like him. Backstage swallowed the sound, the warmth vanished. The hallways were narrower than they'd ever seemed. The laughter muffled into distant noise like a world slipping out of reach. They walked without speaking. Shoes echoed softly. Somewhere a door closed. Somewhere else a telephone rang and went unanswered. They stopped outside a small room. One man opened the door. Inside, Dean stepped in. The room smelled faintly of cologne and old smoke. A single table, 3 chairs, a pitcher of water. The door closed behind him. For a second, no one spoke. Then one of them finally said, "Mr. Martin, this won't take long if you're honest." Dean loosened his shoulders slowly, deliberately, as if preparing for another song. "I've always been a fan of honesty," he replied. "Just never found it paid very well in this business." The man studied him. "We have questions about the people in your circle, about where you've been seen, about who's been financing certain rooms you perform in, certain events." Dean's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "People invite me places," he said. "I sing, sometimes I eat, sometimes I drink, I go home, that's the whole story." The man leaned forward slightly. "We don't think it is." Silence pressed inward. Dean looked from one to the other, then back again. "You boys always crash shows," he said softly, "or am I getting special treatment?" "We've been watching for a long time," the man answered. "Tonight we decided to stop." The words settled heavily. Watching. For a moment Dean saw not the room but years. Smoke-filled backrooms, late laughter, favors traded like playing cards, not crimes but proximity, not guilt, but gravity. The kind that pulls whether you ask it to or not. "You ever notice," Dean said after a moment, "how everyone loves the music but no one wants to know how the stage is built?" The man didn't respond. Dean took a slow breath. "I'm not your villain," he said quietly, "and I'm not your doorway to one." "That remains to be seen." A knock came at the door. One of them stepped out briefly, murmured words too low to hear, then returned. "The press has noticed the interruption," he said. "We don't have much time." Dean's pulse deepened, steady but heavy. "So this is how tonight goes," he said. "You come into my show, you let half of Las Vegas imagine whatever it wants, and then you ask me to explain my life in 10 minutes. "We're asking you to tell the truth," the man replied. Dean met his eyes. "The truth," he said slowly, "isn't always what people want, it's just what they use." Another silence. Then softly, "We will be speaking again, Mr. Martin, very soon." Dean stood. "So will my audience." The man hesitated, then stepped aside. Dean reached for the door. As his hand closed around the handle, a thought cut through him. Not fear, not anger, but clarity. This was not an interruption. This was the opening. And whatever came next would not stay backstage. He stepped back into the corridor. The music swelled faintly from the stage. But Dean Martin knew something had already ended. And something far more dangerous had just begun. When the SHADOWS grew closer. The moment Dean Martin stepped back into the glow of the stage lights, the roar of the audience rose to meet him like a familiar tide. Yet something in him had shifted so deeply that even the thunder of applause couldn't quite reach it. He walked back to the microphone with the same relaxed stride, the same effortless charm, the same half-smile that had carried him across decades of fame. But behind his eyes, a different rhythm now pulsed, slower and heavier, like a second heartbeat he couldn't silence. The band found him again, easing into a playful number that usually loosened his shoulders and lightened his spirit. But tonight the notes floated past him without fully settling. He sang, he joked, he tilted his head just enough to draw laughter, and the audience gladly followed him where they always had, unaware that only minutes earlier he had been standing in a small, airless room with men who spoke in measured tones about watching and questions and circles that were tightening. From the floor, he must have looked exactly as he always did. From the inside, he felt like a man performing on the edge of a fault line, aware that something immense was shifting beneath his feet. He finished the set to a standing ovation that rattled the walls. He bowed, lifted his glass in a casual toast, and let the curtain fall. The instant he crossed back into the narrow corridors behind the stage, the noise dulled, and the warmth dissolved into a cooler, more watchful quiet. Crew members nodded to him as they passed, their smiles a little strained now, curiosity and concern flickering just beneath their professionalism. Word traveled fast in places like this. The sight of two unsmiling men in dark suits leading him away mid-performance had been enough to light a fuse of rumor that no curtain call could smother. Dean moved through it all with practiced ease, but he felt eyes following him, felt conversations lowering as he passed, felt the invisible narrative already beginning to write itself around his name. In his dressing room, he closed the door and stood there longer than usual, one hand still on the handle, as though grounding himself to something solid. The room looked the same as it always did. The familiar couch, the small table with its waiting glass, the mirror glowing with soft bulbs, yet it felt like a set after the actors had gone home, recognizable but stripped of its comfort. He crossed the room and sat, loosening his bow tie, then lifting it free entirely, the silk sliding through his fingers. For a long moment he simply breathed, slow and deliberate, letting the tension settle instead of fighting it. He had always believed that panic was a luxury, and he had never been one to indulge. Still, his thoughts moved restlessly, circling the same questions, watching how long, asking what, circles around him, circles around Frank, around Sammy, around rooms and names and places he had never bothered to count. There was a knock, not the brisk tap of a stagehand, not the hurried rap of a hotel manager. This one was slower, more careful. Dean didn't answer immediately. He reached for the glass on the table, took a measured sip, and only then said, "Come in." The door opened to reveal the hotel's head of security, a broad man with a face built for calm conversations in private hallways. He closed the door gently behind him, as if sealing the room from the noise outside. "Mr. Martin," he said, "there are reporters gathering. Word is spreading. Management thought you'd want to know." Dean nodded once. He had expected as much. "I always appreciate good news delivered softly," he replied. The man hesitated. "Do you need anything?" Dean considered the question, then smiled faintly. "A better decade, maybe, but I'll settle for a few quiet minutes." The man left him with those minutes, though they did not feel quiet. Dean stood and faced the mirror. Without the bow tie, without the glass in his hand, he looked older than the version of himself that lived in headlines and photographs. Not fragile, just real. The lines at the corners of his eyes seemed deeper under this light, carved by years of laughter that had never quite reached the parts of him people didn't see. He studied himself as though he were a stranger, a character whose choices he had yet to fully understand. He had built his life on performance, but somewhere along the way, performance had become protection. Humor had become armor. Charm had become camouflage. And tonight, men who did not care for music or laughter had knocked on that armor to test what lay beneath. Another knock came, firmer this time. "They're ready for you, sir," a voice said through the door. Dean straightened his jacket, adjusted the cuffs again, and let the familiar persona settle back over his shoulders. When he opened the door, the corridor seemed brighter, busier, louder. Assistants moved quickly. Someone handed him a fresh towel he didn't need. Someone else murmured reassurance he didn't ask for. At the far end of the hall, he could already hear the low roar of the press room, the murmur of many voices weaving into one restless sound. Cameras were waiting. Questions were waiting. Stories were already forming, and they would not be kind enough to wait for facts. The press room lights were merciless. They flattened everything, turned every expression into something sharper, more exposed. As Dean entered, flashes ignited like distant lightning, brief bursts of white that left shadows swimming at the edges of his vision. He stepped to the podium with the ease of a man who had stood before crowds his entire adult life, but this crowd did not applaud. They leaned forward. They aimed lenses. They raised hands not to greet, but to claim. "Mr. Martin," someone called before he had even settled his stance. "Can you explain what happened on stage tonight?" Another voice cut in. Were those federal agents? Are you under investigation? What were they asking you? The questions collided in the air, urgent, hungry, each one a thread tugging at the same fabric. Dean lifted one hand, and gradually the noise softened. He had always known how to hold a room. That gift had not left him. "Folks," he said calmly, "if I had known my show was going to include a press conference, I'd have worn a different tie." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Not enough to relax it, but enough to remind them he was still himself. "There was an interruption backstage," he continued. "In this town, interruptions happen. I'm here to sing, not to speculate. I finished my set and I'm heading home." "Are you denying that you were questioned about your associations?" a reporter pressed. Dean met her eyes. "I've spent my life around musicians, actors, businessmen, waiters, drivers, dreamers, and people who haven't slept in 3 days. If knowing people is a crime, this whole city's in trouble." The room stirred. "Are you being targeted?" another asked. Dean paused just long enough to let the weight of the word settle. "Targeted," he repeated, tasting it. "I'm a singer. If someone's listening, I hope they enjoyed the show." He took a step back from the podium, signaling the end. More questions followed, louder now, sharper, but he did not answer them. He let security guide him through the side door and down a separate hall, away from the lights. Outside, the desert night greeted him with cool air and the neon heartbeat of Las Vegas. His car waited at the curb, its dark surface reflecting the glow of signs and passing headlights. As he slid into the back seat, the door closing softly behind him, the city seemed to resume its endless performance, unaware or unconcerned with the small fracture that had just opened in one man's life. The driver pulled away, easing into traffic. For a few minutes, neither spoke. The strip unfurled in light and motion, familiar and strangely distant, like a postcard from a place he was no longer entirely sure he belonged to. Dean watched it pass, the reflections skating across the glass like ghosts of nights he had already lived. He thought of Frank again, of the way his friend laughed with his whole body, of the way their conversations sometimes drifted late into territory neither of them named aloud. He thought of Sammy, of loyalty tested and retested under brighter spotlights than either of them had asked for. He thought of all the rooms he had sung in where doors were closed and voices lowered, not because something criminal was happening, but because power itself had a way of whispering. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge what he had been holding at bay since the agents spoke their first careful words. Whatever this was, it would not end with tonight. It would not be satisfied with a few unanswered questions in a small room backstage. Attention, once focused, rarely drifted away. It sharpened, it narrowed, it demanded. The car turned, leaving the brightest stretch of lights behind. The road ahead darkened slightly, the signs fewer, the noise softer. Dean leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes for a moment. He did not pray. He did not panic. He simply listened to the sound of the engine, to the quiet proof that movement was still possible, that direction was still a choice. When he opened his eyes again, the strip was farther behind them. And with it, the illusion that this night had been just another show. Because Dean Martin knew now, with a clarity that cut through all his practiced ease, that he had crossed an invisible line the moment those men stepped into the light. Whatever questions were coming next would not be asked in crowded rooms. Whatever answers were expected would not be satisfied by charm. And whatever he chose to protect, his friends, his reputation, the fragile private spaces he had carved out beneath the weight of fame, would demand more of him than any audience ever had. The music had carried him through many storms. This time it would not be enough. When Frank Sinatra stepped out of the dark. The following morning did not arrive gently. Las Vegas sunlight poured through the curtains of Dean Martin's suite like a spotlight that refused to dim, bright and unforgiving, exposing every corner of a room that suddenly felt far too quiet. He lay awake long before the city stirred, staring at the ceiling while the events of the night before replayed not as scenes but as sensations. The sudden stillness of the crowd, the wait in the hallway, the way the word watching had echoed long after it was spoken. Fame had always brought attention, but this felt different. This was not admiration. This was not curiosity. This was focus. And focus, when sharpened by power, had a way of turning into pressure. He rose slowly, moving across the carpet in bare feet, and drew the curtains back himself. Below him, the strip was beginning its daily transformation, neon giving way to sun, excess to exhaustion. Workers hosed down sidewalks still sticky with the night's indulgences. Delivery trucks idled. A woman in yesterday's dress crossed the street alone, her heels in her hand. The city looked stripped of its performance now, and in that honesty, Dean saw something of his own reflection. He had built a life on timing, on knowing when to step forward and when to step aside. But whatever rhythm he had been following no longer felt sufficient. Something larger had begun to conduct. He poured himself coffee and let the bitter heat ground him, then sat at the small table by the window. The newspapers had already arrived. They always did. He did not need to open them to know what they said. He could already imagine the words, questions, speculation, the thrill of proximity to scandal dressed up as concern. He left them untouched, as though denying them the satisfaction of his eyes might steal some of their power. The phone rang. He did not jump, but he did not delay either. Some part of him had been waiting for this sound since he closed his eyes. "Hello," he said. There was a pause, just long enough to be unmistakable. "So," came Frank Sinatra's voice, low and familiar, carrying that blend of steel and warmth only he possessed. "You going to tell me what kind of show you put on last night, or do I have to hear it from people who don't know you?" Dean closed his eyes briefly. Of all the calls he expected, this was the one he both wanted and dreaded. "You always did prefer the front row," he replied. "I prefer the truth," Frank said, "and I prefer it from you." Dean leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling again. "Then come by." Frank did not hesitate. "I'm already downstairs." Dean almost smiled. 20 minutes later, Frank Sinatra stood in the doorway of his suite, hat in hand, coat still on, as if he had not trusted himself to slow down even for the elevator ride. He filled the room without effort, not through volume but through presence, the way some men did when their lives had been lived loudly enough that silence made room for them. His eyes went immediately to Dean's face, not the furniture, not the view, not the untouched newspapers. He took in the set of his friend's shoulders, the stillness of his posture, the absence of any easy joke waiting at the corner of his mouth. "Sit," Dean said, gesturing toward the table. Frank sat. He did not reach for coffee. He did not reach for anything. "They say men in dark suits walked you off stage," he said. "They say the press nearly tore the building down after. They say a lot of things." "They always do," Dean replied. Frank watched him closely. "Which ones are true?" Dean took a slow breath. He had sung to rooms of thousands. He had confessed nothing to all of them. Speaking to one man now felt heavier than any audience he had ever faced. "They came into the room," he said. "Not quietly, not by accident. They asked questions about people, about places, about circles." Frank's jaw tightened, not in surprise, but in recognition. And I didn't give them what they wanted." Frank leaned back slightly, eyes never leaving him. "You never do. That's not always the same as doing what's right." Dean considered that. "Sometimes," he said, "it's the only way I know how to do what's right." Silence stretched between them, filled with years neither felt the need to recount. They had met in rooms where ambition was thick as smoke. They had built something between them that was part brotherhood, part survival pact, part shared refusal to belong to any one version of themselves. They had protected each other not because it was convenient, but because it was fundamental. "You know this doesn't end with a few questions," Frank said finally. "I know," Dean replied. Frank nodded once. "Then you also know why I'm here." Dean met his eyes. "To talk me into something I don't want to do." Frank allowed a small, humorless smile. "Or to make sure you don't carry it alone." Dean's fingers tightened around his cup. He had built an entire persona on making weight look like air. He had never been good at letting anyone see how heavy things truly were. "They're not after music," he said quietly. "They're not even after names. They're after leverage, after something that lets them feel like they can map a world that was never meant to be tidy." Frank leaned forward, forearms on the table. "And they won't stop until they think they've drawn all the lines." Dean nodded. "They'll start with questions," Frank continued. "Then pressure, then offers, and then they'll move to the people around you because it's easier to shake a man by shaking the room he stands in." Dean's gaze drifted to the window, to the city stretching endlessly outward. "I don't like the idea of anyone else paying for my choices." Frank's voice softened, but it did not weaken. "You don't get to decide that part. You only get to decide whether your choices mean something when it counts." The words landed without cruelty, but they landed. Dean looked back at him. "Do you ever get tired," he asked, "of always being braced?" Frank's mouth twitched. "Every day, I just don't make a career out of showing it." Dean let out a slow breath that might have been a laugh if it had found more air. They want me to turn my life into a confession, he said. To make every dinner, every handshake, every shared laugh sound like evidence. I can't do that. Not because I'm hiding something criminal, but because I'm not willing to let them decide what loyalty means. Frank studied him, then nodded once. Then you need to be smarter about how you stand. They talked for a long time after that. Not in declarations or plans, but in careful recollections, in mapping the shape of a world that had never fit neatly into anyone's idea of clean lines. They spoke of shows and cities, of contracts and favors, of the way power gathered people who wanted something from it, and the way those people were then judged simply for being near it. They spoke of the cost of becoming an image before becoming a man, and of how difficult it was to be seen clearly once the image had settled. As the morning wore on, the light shifted, crawling across the floor, touching the legs of the table, the edge of the couch, the rim of Dean's glass. Outside, the city grew louder, the day taking on its full voice. Inside, something quieter and more decisive was forming. "Whatever happens," Frank said finally, standing and placing his hat back on his head, "you don't talk to them without counsel and you don't let them isolate you. They make rooms feel small on purpose." Dean stood as well. "I've made a living filling rooms," he replied. "I won't start shrinking now." Frank hesitated, then pulled him into a brief, fierce embrace that was less comfort than confirmation. "Good," he said simply. After Frank left, Dean remained standing in the center of the room long after the door closed. The suite felt different now, less like a refuge, more like a crossroads. He walked back to the table and finally opened one of the newspapers. The headline was exactly what he expected: dramatic, suggestive, empty of anything solid. His name stretched across the page like a question no one yet knew how to answer. He folded the paper and set it aside. The truth was, he did not know where this path led. He only knew that it was no longer one he could walk half asleep, leaning on charm and habit. Whatever was unfolding would demand something else from him, something quieter, firmer, more honest than anything he had ever been required to give on stage. Dean Martin had spent his life making rooms feel easy. Now he would have to learn how to stand in a room that refused to be. And for the first time, he suspected that what lay ahead would not test his voice. It would test his character, the stage he could not escape. The days that followed moved more slowly than Dean Martin was used to, as if time itself had thickened, each hour stretching under a weight no clock could measure. He still performed. He still smiled. He still walked into rooms where people laughed before he spoke and applauded before he sang, but beneath every familiar moment now lived a second reality, one that did not dissolve when the lights dimmed. He noticed the small things he had once ignored. The way conversations quieted when unfamiliar faces entered, the way hotel staff lingered an extra second too long outside his door, the way every telephone ring arrived with a tension that no success, no wealth, no applause could soften. It was not fear that followed him. It was awareness, the sense of being observed not as an artist but as a subject. And for a man who had spent his life choosing when and how he was seen, that shift carried a gravity he could not pretend away. Things came, quiet ones, not dramatic confrontations, not scenes worthy of headlines, but measured conversations in understated rooms where words were selected carefully and meaning hid between them. Men introduced themselves with courtesy that never quite warmed. They spoke of context, of timelines, of clarifying misunderstandings. Dean listened, answering what he could without allowing his life to be turned into a confession shaped by someone else's imagination. He spoke of music, of work, of friendships that had grown in the same soil as his own ambition, in places where dreams were traded as often as favors. He did not deny proximity to power, but he refused to let proximity be mistaken for participation. Each conversation left him more tired than the last, not because he was cornered, but because he was being asked to flatten a complicated life into something simple enough to be filed away. And Dean Martin had never been simple. One evening, after another long day that left his voice intact but his patience worn thin, Dean returned to his home instead of a hotel suite. The quiet there was different, not the hush of a building designed for turnover, but the settled silence of a place that remembered him. He moved through the room slowly, touching nothing, noticing everything. The framed photographs on the walls caught his eye in a way they hadn't before. He and Frank, younger, louder, grinning like men who believed the world was an open door. He and Sammy, arms slung over shoulders, defiant joy radiating from a friendship that had learned to exist under lights that did not always love it back. Stills from films where he had played men who knew exactly who they were, even when everything around them fell apart. Characters, all of them, but built from something real. He poured himself a drink and sat where he could see the photographs at once. He realized then that what unsettled him most was not the scrutiny itself, but what it threatened to touch. He had always accepted that fame would cost him privacy. He had not expected it to ask him to redefine loyalty, to speak of people he cared for as if they were pieces in someone else's puzzle, to narrate his own past through a lens that could only see suspicion. Later that night, the phone rang again. He knew before he answered who it would be. "They want to talk," Frank said without preamble. "Not like before." Dean closed his eyes. "There's always a not like before." "This time they're bringing more than questions," Frank continued. "They're bringing conclusions." Dean let the words settle. Conclusions were what happened when curiosity grew tired. "Then I suppose," he said slowly, "it's time I brought something of my own." They met the next day not in a club, not in an office, but in a modest, sunlit room that felt intentionally ordinary. No glamour, no shadows, just a table, chairs, and the quiet insistence of seriousness. The men who waited for him were polite, composed, efficient. They laid out timelines, associations, observations. They spoke not in accusations, but in structures, as if assembling a house and inviting him to comment on its design. Dean listened, hands folded loosely before him, letting them finish. When they were done, the room seemed to lean inward, waiting. Dean did not raise his voice. He did not deflect with humor. He did not perform. He spoke instead about work, about the strange truth of show business, where success drew every kind of person toward it, not all of them admirable, not all of them dangerous, but all of them human. He spoke about how a man could share a meal without sharing a motive, how he could perform in a room without controlling who bought the tickets, how he could know people without becoming them. He spoke about the difference between existing near power and existing for it. He acknowledged the messiness of the world he lived in without romanticizing it, without pretending it was cleaner than it was, but also without surrendering it to caricature. He said he would answer questions. He said he would not surrender his life to implication. He said that loyalty for him was not secrecy, it was humanity. The men listened. They asked more. He answered what he could, and where he could not, he said so, not evasively, simply honestly. The room did not transform, no dramatic shift occurred. No one stood and announced the end of anything, but something quieter happened, something Dean felt rather than saw. The air changed, not lighter, clearer. The conversation moved from the architecture of suspicion to the slower work of understanding. When it was over, he walked out alone. Outside, the world looked ordinary in a way that startled him. People passed. Cars moved. A woman laughed somewhere nearby. Life, indifferent to investigations, continued. Dean stood for a moment, letting the sound of it reach him. He realized then that he had spent these past weeks bracing for an ending. What he was standing in now did not feel like one. It felt like a return to something he had not known he'd been drifting from. That night, he performed again. There were no agents at the foot of the stage. No interruption, no sudden hush. Just music, light, and the familiar expectation that he would make an evening easier to live inside. When he stepped into the glow, the applause rose as it always had. But when he began to sing, something in his voice surprised him. It was steadier. Not smoother, not louder, but steadier, as if some subtle tension he had carried without naming had finally loosened its grip. He did not sing to escape. He sang to arrive. As he moved through the set, he found himself watching the audience not as a mass, but as individuals. A couple holding hands too tightly. A man laughing alone, a woman closing her eyes as if storing the sound. These were not witnesses. They were not judges. They were people looking for the same thing he was, a moment that made sense, even if only for the length of a song. Between numbers, he spoke more than usual. Not jokes, not stories polished by repetition. Just small truths about how strange it was to stand under lights and still feel unseen sometimes, about how easy it was to confuse applause with understanding, about how necessary it was, occasionally, to let the music stop long enough to hear your own thoughts. The room did not erupt with laughter. It leaned closer. It listened. By the time he reached his final song, Dean understood what this season of pressure had given him. It had not cleared his name in headlines. It had not simplified his world. It had done something quieter and far more lasting. It had reminded him that a life could not be summarized by who looked at it, only by how it was lived when the looking grew uncomfortable. When the last note faded, the applause that followed did not crash. It rose. It filled the space. It stayed. Dean bowed not with flourish, but with something like gratitude. Backstage later, alone again, he did not rush to pour a drink. He sat instead, letting the silence be what it was. He thought of the night the music had stopped, of the narrow hallway, of the small room, of the question he had been forced to ask himself when there was no crowd to distract him. Who am I when no one is clapping? The answer did not arrive in words. It arrived in a feeling he had not known he was missing, a quiet alignment, a sense that the man on the posters and the man in the mirror were closer than they had been in a long time. Dean Martin rose, switched off the light, and walked out. The stage behind him was empty. But for the first time in weeks, he did not feel like he had left himself there.